Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bryan Spillane, the consumer staples analyst here at Bank of America. Thank you for joining us for our session, Social Standards. With us today is Jordan Breslauer. Jordan's the Vice President of Data Analytics and Customer Experience at Social Standards. He's been a valued partner of ours as we've really tried to glean consumer insights across a number of categories and topics over the last couple of years. Today, we're going to focus our conversations or our analysis and discussion on beverage alcohol and the rapidly evolving hard seltzer market. So without any further ado, Jordan, welcome. And
thanks so much, Brian.
I'll turn it over to you. Jordan's got some slides he's going to run through, and then we'll also open it up for Q&A at the end. So Jordan, I'll let you roll.
Thanks, Brian. And yeah, it's been great to come back and do this for the fourth year running. So why don't we hop right into the good stuff, into the insights, and beginning on slide 3, we have a couple trends we wanted to first examine around hard seltzer and White Claw on the first chart. So what we're looking at here is the trend in consumer conversations around hard seltzer in the blue line and White Claw in the gray line. And one of the things that we'll notice is how the category used to be pretty intertwined with the White Claw trend line, how White Claw really made up almost all, if not the majority, of all hard seltzer conversations until the past year, where we started to see the trend lines move in a bit of different directions. You can see White Claw has really declined over the past year, while hard seltzer's trend line has remained rather stable. So I think this is an indication of two things. One, that White Claw as a brand has been declining relative to the category. And so whatever growth we're seeing in hard seltzer is really coming from a lot of these new entrants. And so the overall excitement that we see for the category has remained flat year over year. Now, that's not to say that sales and the category as a whole hasn't scaled. We know that from the sales data. However, just from the social data, it's kind of an indication that maybe consumer excitement around hard seltzer has begun to plateau. And it's kind of staying stable. It's become more of a mature category as opposed to the emerging category it was a couple of years ago. Now, as it's moved more mainstream, I think another really interesting trend chart to look at is at the bottom. The blue line there is the hard seltzer conversation trend, and the orangish line is hard seltzer posts that are coming from influencers. Now, as the category has become more mainstream, we've actually seen influencer posts decline, which is an indication that the category is now being sustained more by everyday people than previously, where it had more of an influencer footprint. Now, moving on to slide 4, another interesting observation in these trends that we're seeing is that a lot of the growth that we're seeing in hard seltzer globally is coming outside of the U.S. So the blue line on this chart, on the first one, is showing U.S. conversation trend for hard seltzer, and then the red line is showing the trend for non-U.S. in hard seltzer. The bottom is doing a similar thing with hard seltzer U.S. in the blue line and then Europe in the red line. And so what we're seeing is that a lot of that growth in hard seltzer is coming from outside of the U.S., where you can see that trend line has gone up, while hard seltzer has been flat, if not declining just a bit in the U.S. So overall, in addition to Europe, another area that we've seen some growth in hard seltzer has been in Brazil. Hard seltzer still remains predominantly U.S. We see about 75% of the conversations coming from there, but that ratio has changed a bit over time, particularly in the last 6 to 9 months. So moving on to the next slide. Oh, yes, Brian, did you have a question?
I was going to say, Jordan, I was just going to ask, just as we're looking at the trends increasing in Europe and as you mentioned in Brazil as well, are there any similarities or differences to when we first started to really see the social media activity on hard seltzers, 3 and 4 years ago? If I remember it correctly, early on it was a lot of CrossFit, keto, fitness beer, kind of like the Mick Ultra consumer. So just curious if the, kind of the early stages in these markets, is it a similar sort of type of consumer interest, or is there any way we can tell whether it's something different than that?
It's a great question, and I think it's something that will be seen in a couple slides when we go into some of the shifts that we're seeing in the hard seltzer category. A lot of the different things that we're beginning to see it shift back to is that health and wellness sector, really its roots, right, where it first began. And as we know, if we look at things in the beverage alcohol space and in the food and beverage space that skew towards Europe, it's a lot of those different health and wellness topics, particularly things around active lifestyles and low carb. So yes, I think in terms of why we're seeing some of the growth in Europe and what European hard seltzer consumption is connected to, it seems to be very much so in that health and wellness space. Brazil, I haven't looked into as much. I'd have to go and better understand what's driving some of that. But certainly in Europe, that health and wellness connection is really speaking to that European consumer.
Thanks.
Awesome. So moving on to slide 5 now. What we're looking at here is who is the hard seltzer consumer. Now, what you'll notice in that first column is we have the raw percentage of conversations that are coming from particular genders, ages, ethnicities, and income levels. Now, we need to consider, though, that Instagram as a whole skews highly female, younger, and white Caucasian, as does the beverage alcohol space on Instagram. And so anytime that we're looking at a particular percentage, we need to have some sort of normalization factor versus all of Instagram and beverage alcohol in order to bring context to that data point. And that's what the percentiles help us to do. 50th percentile is median concentration. If you're above that, you're over-indexed with that demo. If you're below that, you're under-indexed with that demo. So what we see that is unique about hard seltzer's demographics is, well, it represents pretty much so what you'd expect the gender split to be for the average beverage alcohol product, but it's very much skewed towards that 21 to 29-year-old consumer. And interestingly as well, the higher income, in addition to aspects of some of the lower income consumer as well. The ethnicity, though, I think is a really important point to consider in terms of how that's changed over the past 26 months. So we can see right now, Hispanic is the one ethnicity that is over-indexed with hard seltzer. And on the right side, we can see a trend in the raw percentage of hard seltzer conversations coming from white Caucasians in the blue line, or blue bars, I should say, and Hispanics in the gray bars. Now, of course, these axes scale differently, but what we see here is white Caucasian contribution has been declining, while Hispanic contribution has been increasing. So as the category has evolved and grown bigger and bigger, it has shifted away from being just a white Caucasian consumed product to now being consumed by a lot of other ethnicities, in this case, very much so becoming more Hispanic skewed over time. Now, moving on to slide 6, speaking to some of the shifts, as I was alluding to before, that we're seeing in the hard seltzer category. On the y-axis here, we're looking at a variety of different topics and the percentage of hard seltzer conversations that they're mentioned within. So things like gluten-free or party are highly mentioned in hard seltzer conversations. The x-axis is giving us an appreciation for how this has shifted over the last 12 months. So things to the right of that vertical line have grown, while things to the left of that vertical line have declined. And so what we've seen is that the category over the last 12 months is really going back towards its roots, towards that health and wellness sector. As you can see, things like gluten-free or vegan or low-calorie or organic have all grown. You also see a huge increase in a variety of different flavors and a shift also towards more craft, speaking to maybe some of those new upstarts that we're seeing enter the space. In contrast, we've seen the category shift away from partying and topics like wasted or drunk, that drinking games culture, as we like to say. And so overall, that really speaks to where the hard seltzer category has shifted towards in the past year, going back towards that health and wellness route and away from the party drinking culture lifestyle. So moving on now to investigate specific brands and how the competitive landscape has been shifting, I'm going to move on to slide 8 and look at the top 7 brands currently in terms of their penetration of hard seltzer conversations and how that's been changing over time. So we can see White Claw on the green line has lost a lot of share of hard seltzer conversations over the past 16 to 18 months. Back in November of 2019, it was at about 80% of all hard seltzer conversations. Now it's shifted down to about 40% of all hard seltzer conversations. And a lot of that decline has been due to a variety of different brands eating into their share. We see brands like Truly and Bud Light Seltzer have grown during that time frame. We also see some new upstarts, some brand new brands just entering the space over the last couple of months, taking a decent amount of share. Brands like Cacti, the Travis Scott ABI partnership, or another ABI upstart brand this year, Michelob Ultra Hard Seltzer, in addition to Coors Seltzer and Press Seltzer also gaining over the past couple months. Now, when we think about why White Claw may have declined during this period of time, I want to shift our gears over to slide 9 and compare the topics that are mentioned alongside White Claw to the topics that are mentioned alongside all of hard seltzer. So on the x-axis, we're looking at the importance of a topic to hard seltzer conversations. The 50th percentile is the median. So if you're to the right of that vertical line, it over-indexes in White Claw conversations. The y-axis is showing you importance to hard seltzer. So if you're above that horizontal line, you're over-indexed in hard seltzer. That blue diagonal line is equal importance to both. So if you're below that blue diagonal line, it's skewed towards White Claw. If you're above that diagonal line, it's skewed towards hard seltzer. And the final key portion of this chart in terms of orientation is the color of the bubble. So things in green are growing in hard seltzer, while things in red are declining in hard seltzer. And what we see here is a lot of these different topics that are more associated with White Claw than hard seltzer. Things like partying and drunk and college and basic and drinking games are all declining year over year in hard seltzer conversation. While things like craft or natural or lemon or other flavors like strawberry and peach, which are associated with all of hard seltzer, but not with White Claw, have grown year over year in the category. And so this really shows how White Claw, by aligning itself with a consumer that is more fickle and also has been declining over the past year across all of beverage alcohol and in the hard seltzer category as well, has caused it to decline relative to the rest of the category. And then finishing off the section on slide 10, we incorporate this metric called user retention on the x-axis. This metric helps us to understand consumer loyalty by examining what percentage of those talking about a particular brand in the current month talk about it the following month. So if we look on this chart here, brands further to the left have less loyal consumers, so churn through consumers more frequently or more fickle, while brands to the right have a more loyal set of consumers. The y-axis is simply just recognizing their percent penetration of total hard seltzer conversations. So of course, White Claw still remaining the biggest brand in the space. As you go lower, you have smaller brands. So a couple big observations here. White Claw has some of the least loyal consumers in the space. So that could be contributing to why it's been declining and losing share relative to other key competitors. And we see that new upstart brands like Vizzy or Press Seltzer, in addition to a brand like Wild Basin, have had more success retaining their consumers. So as they begin to scale, they just have a really, really loyal consumer base that they can work off of. In contrast, Cacti, as a recent launch, you can see its user retention is in line with White Claw. So that's not necessarily a good sign for the brand. It had a really, really strong launch into the market, but as it currently stands, its user retention is not as strong as some other smaller upstarts in the space. So it's had a real success making that first splash, but it's not necessarily retaining consumers as well as other upstarts month over month. So I'm going to finish off that section and now move into a real core part of the presentation where there's been a lot of blurring in the category, as hard seltzer is one version, of course, of a hard beverage that's had a lot of success and has defined the space over the past few years. But now we're having a lot of other types of canned beverages and RTDs emerge as well. And that's what I want to examine in this section, beginning on slide 12. And so what we're looking at in this top chart here is the trend in consumer conversations around hard seltzer in the green line, and then a bunch of the other RTDs right below that. So prepared cocktails in the blue, canned wine in the purple, hard kombucha, and so on and so forth. So a couple of key observations here, comparing that green line, which as we talked about before, has been pretty stable for hard seltzer over the past year, of course, exhibiting seasonality. While the blue line, prepared cocktails, has demonstrated pretty continuous growth from last year going into this year. And you can see now, at its current state, it sits at about 40 to 50% the size of hard seltzer in terms of posts per day from consumers. Now, a couple other things to keep our eye on. The bottom chart is showing us that growth rate trended out over time. So if we think about back in January 2020, hard seltzer had exploded relative to early 2019. So you see a massive, massive growth rate there. But now if you follow that green line, it's now closer to that zero mark, meaning that it's not exhibiting any sort of notable year-over-year change, pretty much remaining flat year-over-year. While in the blue line, we see prepared cocktails continues to demonstrate that strong year-over-year growth. And in the last couple months, we've really seen two specific categories emerge. One is hard seltzer lemonade, which is a portion of the hard seltzer category. And the other is hard iced tea in that orange line there, really starting to take off in the last couple months and demonstrate increased growth month over month. So
hey,
moving
Jordan,
on. Okay. Yep.
Jordan, can I ask a question? So just on this point, just want to make sure I understand. If we're looking at the blue line, right, which is the prepared cocktails, can you give us a sense of, like, in absolute terms, right? I understand it's like 40 to 50% the size of hard seltzer in post per day today, but if we were to compare that to where hard seltzers were in like 2017, 2018, right? So the kind of the infancy, if you will, of hard seltzers. Is it? I mean, relative size, are the posts actually posting level higher than where seltzers were at that early stage of their life cycle?
That's a great question. So I'm actually going to take a quick look on my end within the application. One of the advantages of being able to do this live. And I see here when we do that, the current post volume is higher than it was for hard seltzer in late 2018, early 2019. So that's speaking to, prepared cocktails may be close to really having that explosion moment. They don't have that same sort of, I would say, brand leader that the hard seltzer space had in White Claw. White Claw was like that pioneer that came in and really led the way for everybody else.
Right.
But prepared cocktails doesn't have a single brand that stands out that much above the others. One brand I can say that has a decent amount of share, but nowhere near the share White Claw had of hard seltzer would be cutwater spirits. So in that respect, it's a much more fragmented space than the hard seltzer one is. Certainly the volume's there, but arguably more competitive from the early onset than the hard seltzer category was, which is really just dominated by a single player.
And then do we know, and maybe this is further down the presentation, but do we know what's attracting consumers? Like, why are they posting, right? So what are the attributes associated with prepared cocktail posts, and how do those compare? And if you've got that further down, I don't mean to jump ahead of you. But.
Yeah, no, I'm loving all these questions. It's certainly something that we're going to discuss in a couple slides. One of the big differentiations is we see hard seltzer much more associated with those health and wellness lifestyle topics, while we see prepared cocktails much more aligned with celebratory occasions and different ingredients and flavors. So we'll get into that soon enough. I think one of the next things, though, I wanted to talk about was some of this consumer overlap, because we are seeing that the hard seltzer consumer is very similar in terms of the same consumer is talking about hard seltzer and these other categories. And so I want to talk a little bit about that on slide 13, where we're going to go and look at, on the y-axis, the percentage of hard seltzer consumers talking about one of these alternative categories. So you can see, for example, the one hard seltzer lemonade is the highest percentage, because, if you're a hard seltzer consumer, you probably have a higher likelihood of trying hard seltzer lemonade. So about 5% around of all hard seltzer consumers have talked about hard seltzer lemonade in the recent quarter. And then you see below that, the next highest is prepared cocktails. So prepared cocktails, and then right below that, you have hard kombucha and hard iced tea as the next two, with canned wine and hard coffee much more distant and lower on this list. The x-axis here, though, is key in terms of the change over the last 12 months. So topics to the right of that, or products to the right of that vertical line, have grown with the hard seltzer consumer, while topics to the left of it have declined. So what we're seeing here that I think is really, really key is that hard iced tea has exploded with hard seltzer consumers over the past 12 months. It's up about 1,000% with these consumers during that time frame. Now, prepared cocktails is also up a ton too. It's up about 200% with these consumers. The scale of this chart is just being thrown off by the fact that hard iced tea has really, really exploded with these consumers over the past 12 months. Now, note though, prepared cocktails still remains the biggest threat, as it is still the largest out of all of these in terms of share of total hard seltzer consumer conversations. Now, I think, though, when we think about the future of which of these presents the biggest threat, that's really going to come into clearer vision in the next slide, where we incorporate the metric of user retention. So the y-axis here is looking at the overall size of the specific product category. Of course, you can see hard seltzer the largest, with prepared cocktails about 50% the size. And then the other categories all representing much smaller portions of total beverage alcohol. And then the x-axis showing us that user retention metric, that consumer loyalty measurement. So out of all of these, prepared cocktails has the most loyal consumer out of all of these different blurred RTD categories, while hard coffee and hard iced tea are much further to the left, have a much less loyal consumer, a much more fickle consumer than the rest of them. You can see hard seltzer is somewhere in the middle of all of these from a loyalty perspective. So as we consider that, just consider looking at how loyal the prepared cocktail consumer is and its growth. Those are two signs that I really want us to consider of why prepared cocktails out of all of these different segments probably represents the biggest threat to the hard seltzer category over the next 12 to 24 months. Now, Another really, really key point to consider on this chart is the color of the bubbles. And if I want you to leave anything today, it's this specific point. The color of the bubbles here help us to understand whether the dot or whether that product category is declining in its user retention or increasing in its user retention over the last 12 months. And so what we can see here is that prepared cocktails, its user retention has been growing over the last 12 months, while hard iced tea's user retention has been declining over the last 12 months. And so why this is so key is when we're looking at categories that we see that are going to trend into the future, we not only want to see that they're growing in terms of conversation volume, which as we talked about in previous slides, both prepared cocktails and hard iced tea are, but we also want to see that their user retentions are high relative to other key categories and are growing. And so what we see with hard iced tea is not only does it have lower user retention, but that user retention has been declining over the past 12 months, while prepared cocktails has high user retention that's been growing over the last 12 months. And that's one of the reasons we believe that hard iced tea has a higher chance to fizzle out than prepared cocktails, and prepared cocktails looks like the category that's most likely to threaten hard seltzer over the upcoming 12 to 24 months. So moving on to some of those comparisons, the next two slides are going to compare hard seltzer to hard iced tea and then hard seltzer to prepared cocktails. The x-axis here is looking at the importance to hard seltzer, and the y-axis is looking at the importance to hard iced tea. So anything to the right of that vertical line is over-indexed with hard seltzer. Anything that is above that horizontal line is over-indexed with hard iced tea. And that blue line is equal importance to both. So things below that blue line skewing hard seltzer, things above that line skewing more towards hard iced tea. And what we see is that those health and wellness benefits here are rather unique to hard seltzer. They're not really over-indexed or even mentioned in a lot of different cases alongside hard iced tea. So people aren't really participating in hard iced tea for the health benefits. It seems like there's much more of an enjoyment aspect with hard iced tea. And a flavor aspect as well. So we see things like sweet and celebration and premium skewing more towards the hard iced tea category than you see towards the hard seltzer category. Now on slide 16, we do the same thing looking at prepared cocktails with hard seltzer on the X and prepared cocktails on the Y. And what we see here is that ultimately, the health and wellness topic still skewing much more towards hard seltzer, while similarly to hard iced tea, we see things like celebrations and topics like treat yourself and relaxing and mixology skewed much more towards prepared cocktails relative to hard seltzer. So that prepared cocktail space much more aligned to celebratory occasions and also partying, it appears, than all of hard seltzer is.
Very strong network.
And then I wanted to finish this off on the final slide, slide 17, by looking at abroad versus in the U.S., which of these categories may pose bigger threats to hard seltzer. And so the y-axis here is looking at whether the product category is over-indexed in the U.S., and then the x-axis is looking at whether the product category is over-indexed in the UK. So topics to the right of the vertical line, over-indexed in the UK. Topics above that horizontal line, over-indexed in the US. And then the color of the bubble here, very key, is whether that topic is growing in its skew towards the UK over the last 12 months. So we see even though hard seltzer is under-indexed in the UK but over-indexed in the US, over the last 12 months, it's grown in its skew towards the UK. Out of all of these categories, though, as it currently stands, prepared cocktails and canned wine pose bigger threats to hard seltzer in the UK market, given that they're both over-indexed in the UK, and as evidenced by the bubbles, particularly prepared cocktails, growing very fast in the UK relative to other parts of the globe. And so I wanted to finish it off with this slide and now open it up to any questions. Really appreciate everybody taking the time to listen in and hear a bit about how hard seltzer has changed over the past couple months and year, and how these new categories are having an impact on its evolution.
Hey, thanks, Jordan. Very insightful. So just before we kick off Q&A, if anybody does have a question they want to ask, you can post it in the chat, and we can read the questions off to Jordan. So again, any questions anybody has, you can put them right in the chat, please. So Jordan, just circling back a little bit to the the cocktails. I guess is there anything in the posts that we can glean that maybe differentiate a little bit in terms of either convenience? It's kind of like they solve a problem, right? Like, someone may not really be confident that they can mix a great cocktail, but if they buy one that is good, right, you kind of solve the problem for somebody. So
yeah.
so is it convenience, or any other attributes that kind of point to the consumer really looking for or attaching that attribute to it, that it somehow is kind of solved the problem?
Yeah, I think we do see a lot of people talking about its versatility from the aspect of being more to go. Like, we see that topic highly over-indexed in it, much
Right.
more than you'd see in the hard seltzer category. I think in terms of the other aspects of convenience, so the fact that it's easier than let's say, making your own cocktail, we see topics like easy or simple over-indexing more in its conversations relative to all of cocktails or all of beverage alcohol. So I find that to be an interesting thing, and particularly since, if you think about it, there's all this different content out there from influencers that talks about easy cocktails to make. So the fact that prepared cocktails still has more equity around easy and simple, despite the fact that there might be an influencer push towards people talking about easy cocktail recipes for themselves to make, really speak to how people have that association with prepared cocktails in that way. And I think speak to the consumer excitement around it as a substitute relative to traditional cocktail making.
And I guess that was my second question on the topic, is just, I know we've talked about it as a threat potentially to hard seltzers, which again, if you think about, you're competing in these for that, convenient, ready to drink sort of occasion, right? I understand that. But is it complementary potentially to spirits and spirits brands, or is it almost cannibalistic, right? You'll sell fewer bottles of tequila because you're just selling more servings of pre-made cocktails. So anything in the, that you can glean from the insights here to give us a sense to whether or not something we should be watching?
It's a really good question. So a couple of key data points to consider there. One, in terms of cocktails right now, particularly cocktails at home, way, way higher than they were pre-COVID. Of course, down from the height of pre-COVID, but cocktails are still up right now. People really leaned into their home bars during COVID times. And I think we need to consider this evolution of cocktails overall before we even get into the prepared cocktail space, that as people go back out to bars, out to restaurants, cocktails will naturally shift back towards more going out than enjoying at home. So as that happens, I think we need to consider what sort of impact that has on overall cocktails generally. People really got excited about making their own cocktails. Will they be as excited about getting cocktails at bars when they go back out? I think that remains to be seen. As it compares, though, to prepared cocktails, right now, since they've been running both as an increase during COVID times, both prepared cocktails up and overall cocktails up, it's hard to tell right now what the exact cannibalization impact has been, since they've both been having success during this time. The thing I would note, though, is we should probably be looking at which prepared cocktails or types of them are having the most success in order to try and better understand which has the most cannibalization potential. So, for example, if we're seeing more prepared cocktails that are whiskey cocktails or gin cocktails, if we're seeing that, that could be an indication that it could increase cannibalization of those sorts of cocktails versus maybe other cocktails, such as vodka cocktails, which may be more overall cocktail integrated or over-indexed than over-indexed with prepared cocktails. So I think that's the way we would begin to look at different signals, but I don't have a specific position on it right now, given the way in which these things have been running in tandem during the COVID era.
And then just flipping back to hard seltzers, you made the mention that early on influencers were, a big part of the mix, right, in terms of postings, and now that's kind of become less of a factor. And so I guess I get two questions related to that. One is, have you seen that in other verticals that you cover, right? So like cosmetics, I guess, is one that comes to mind, which is very influencer heavy. As a category and a brand like White Claw becomes more established, does it just naturally become, more the crowd kind of talking about it versus being influencer led? Is that just a natural evolution?
Yeah, good question. So I think one notable thing about that slide was that overall conversations remained consistent, even though influencer conversations fell off. And to me, that's a really important point, because generally when influencer conversations fall off, you see a category or you see a brand also fall off. So the fact that hard seltzer has been resilient despite the decline in influencers, I think is pretty notable. I've seen on some brands and some product categories, when the influencer leaves, you're dead. Like, I've seen that very much so in a variety of different beauty brands in particular.
Right.
But in this case, the fact that they're able to sustain the same level of conversations despite influencers not talking about them as much really shows how this is not bought, or it's not it's not just certain individuals. It's really left that identity and moved to the everyday person. And I think that speaks to a real maturing of the category, and also speaks to how it's here to stay. Even though conversations might not be growing as much as they were before, it might not have been realistic to maintain that same level of acceleration. So I think we're reaching this point where hard seltzer is gaining its maturity, which means it might not be experiencing those huge double, triple-digit growths that it was experiencing in previous years. It might just start to be around what it is as we go into the future.
Right. And I suppose we could also hypothesize that, especially in 2020, where you saw the beer companies advertise their hard seltzer brands in the more traditional forms, whether it's TV or the kind of the traditional digital channels that they use, that sort of picks up where the influencers leave off, right? I mean, I guess that's, it gets big enough that it justifies having an advertising budget, right? And then that kind of helps. I suppose that could be part of what's happening as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. The influencers might not think it's as cool as it once was.
Okay, well, yeah, right. Or you're going to reach me. It's hard to reach me with an influencer, but
yeah.
Okay, so we are now up against time. So Jordan, I want to thank you again for taking time with us. Anybody there in the audience who has some questions or want to be connected with Jordan, just please let me know. And, stay safe, and hopefully we'll get a chance to see you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much.